Web novels, web serials, or simply web fiction. These are all terms for the new lifeblood of storytelling.
South Korea's fiction-related web content industry has secured an export deal with a number of Europe-based companies worth some $5.3 million US.
For centuries, if you wanted to share your epic tales far and wide, you had to go through traditional publishers. Now, though, the internet has changed everything. Reader feedback and approval is often instantaneous. Edits can be made at a moment's notice, and the traditional publishing houses have started taking notice. Because web fiction actually makes money now. As with all new industries, however, the landscape isn't all sunshine and rainbows. There's a lot more to the world of web fiction than meets the eye. So what is web fiction? What are some of its biggest stories and genres? How did it get so popular? And what lies ahead in its future? To start, what is web fiction? The name gives it away, right? Well, let's get more specific. We're not going to cover everything that could possibly be considered fiction on the internet. No hypertext fiction, no choose-your-own-adventures, no play-by-post games, and no webcomics. For the purposes of this video, we will be looking solely at serialized prose, particularly prose in genres that major publishing houses don't typically value. Outside of East Asia, when was the last time you saw a xianxia novel on the shelf? Web fiction isn't published in one go. It's doled out, serialized on various platforms in episodes or chapters until it becomes as large as standalone novels, duologies, or even massive 10-book epics. And it all starts with one chapter. One chapter at a time until all your fantasies are set onto the screen, ready to be posted on forums, fiction sites, and apps full of readers willing to support your erratic creativity. So how did this start? Where did this start? Well, it's a mix, depending on who you ask. But there's a clear timeline, a red thread of passionate storytelling that we can follow. By the 2000s, online writing had long been simmering in a few quiet corners of the internet. Most stories had been serialized on people's personal websites, blogs, or if they were fanfiction, on websites dedicated to a specific fandom. But as the new millennia approached, so too did the rise of archive and aggregate websites. Fanfiction.net was established in 1998, LiveJournal in 1999. Both mashed hundreds of thousands of stories together in the same convenient place. Fanfiction.net in the form of an endless archive. LiveJournal by hosting scores of blogs on a searchable database. In their heyday, these websites encompassed three of the great appeals of web fiction: a blank canvas, a low barrier of entry, and an extremely accessible free platform. Put those together, and you strike gold with a huge, immediate, hungry audience. It was easier to discover new work, new fandoms, and discuss them with others than ever before. It was also easier to create work and have faith that it would be read, filling an artistic void. Sometimes those niche stories could explode in popularity. For example, 50 Shades of Grey began as a Twilight fanfiction. It wasn't just fan works that were getting easier to find and discuss. Not long afterward came a boom in easily accessible light novel translations. Translation groups that had once been isolated on personal blogs were now logged in databases like Baka Updates and Bakatsuki, both founded in 2006. And in the years to come, these light novels would spread even further, becoming a guiding light for online fantasy fiction. Light novels, or LNs, are novellas with a few illustrations. They're light because they're short, sweet, and usually escapist power trips. Originating in Japan, they tend to use conventions we can recognize in manga and anime. Many of the more popular LNs are centralized around super-capable high school protagonists. You know the drill. Fantastic powers, progressive buffs, piles of wealth, new worlds offering the prospect of a better life. They're the ultimate fix for readers craving power fantasies and seemingly infinite. Sites like Novel Updates and Light Novel Update continue to host scores of series, translated from Chinese and Korean as well as Japanese for free. But the market for these stories is also growing. By 2023, the top 3 best-selling light novel series combined, That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, A Certain Magical Index, and Sword Art Online had sold over 100 million copies. While most of those sales happened in Japan, a significant percentage of those were sold worldwide, and these light novels are only the foundations of media empires. Spin-off manga, anime, merchandise, and even feature films are now marketed globally. But remember, it was the rising tide of freely available translations online that proved to companies that light novels had an international audience whom they could sell it to. And sell they certainly do. In fact, many global anime and manga fans now complain that light novel adaptations are oversaturating the market. Less than 10 years after the first Sword Art Online volume made it to physical booksellers in the United States in 2014. The impact of light novels on web fiction is undeniable, particularly when it comes to the broad genre known as progression fantasy, which intersects with a slew of conventions in anime, films, and novels to spawn countless subgenres. From East Asia, we have Shansha, or cultivation fantasy. From Europe, we have lit RPGs. Both have a heavy emphasis on constantly progressing, ascending to the next rank, unlocking the next level, beating the next boss, or simply maintaining your power lest rivals surpass you. What unites them all is the most unique thing about progression fantasy: conventions from video games. Web fiction is taking conventions from the MMORPGs that themselves are played on the web. Video games are not just about moving on to the next level, but also showing that progress in clear, distinct terms, reminding the player how far they've come. Marry that clarity with the power fantasies we expect from LNs, and you have a nigh addictive combination. Fans themselves will joke that they like to read progression fantasy just to watch the numbers going up. Let's dig a little deeper into what these subgenres entail. The Shansha novels, so prominent in Eastern web fiction, have strong roots in wuxia, or martial arts fantasy, which itself is rooted in a long lineage of Asian philosophies and folklore. They tend to follow protagonists who quest for immortality through not only magic and training, but also problem-solving, psychological revelations, and good old-fashioned pills. Getting closer to ultimate power isn't just a means to furthering the plot, sometimes it is the plot. Lit RPGs, meanwhile, have deeper roots in Western fantasy, frequently using medieval-esque settings and magic systems that may borrow from light novel worlds just as much as they do from Tolkien or Dungeons & Dragons. In a lit RPG, a character will be aware that they have, for example, 5 stat points in charisma and use their knowledge of these numbers to their advantage. Today, thanks to the ever-growing accessibility of the internet, not all wuxia and xiangxia comes from China and South Korea, just as not all fantasy harkening back to the Middle Ages or Middle Earth is written in the West. While these subgenres might be separate, the boundaries between all genres are permeable. Everything influences everything else. Many sites will host cultivation novels alongside lit RPGs, with reader bases familiar with the tropes of both and eager to mix them. So, what website is the hub for web fiction today? Well, of course there's no single hub. Even in the old days, you couldn't find every fanfiction under the sun on fanfiction.net, and there are different hubs in different languages. If you heard lit RPG and your reaction was, "Hey, I read the first book defined as a lit RPG ever," your hub may be the Russian language website samizdat.ru, or any of a number of sites copying stories in translation. If you read in English and consider He Who Fights with Monsters a household name in the world of progression fantasy though, you might say that hub is the website Royal Road. But if your name happens to be Royal Road, you might say that hub is South Korean, because Royal Road site runners actually got their start on a forum called Royal Road Legends, where they posted translations of one of the biggest progression fantasy series of all time, the legendary Moonlight Sculptor, which is South Korean. Yet again, everything influences everything else. In fact, you may not be aware of just how big South Korea is in web fiction right now. Have you heard of Tapas? That website not only hosts web fiction and webtoons created by anyone, but also launches premium series and print releases. It's Korean. Radish and Wattpad? Also Korean. Web fiction has been huge within South Korea for over a decade. The narrative of indie web fiction author gets cult following, book deal, and maybe a movie or TV show if the concept is mainstream enough doesn't just happen in the United States. The romance web novel Coffee Prince did it on Korean airwaves all the way back in 2007. just to name one example. Web fiction isn't just huge, it's big business. South Korea may boast a bustling domestic web fiction industry, but China stands as the largest consumer and exporter of web fiction, hosting well over 20 million writers and nearly a billion words delivered to a ravenous audience of 500 million online readers every year. Through sites like Chidian and WebNovel, under mammoth tech companies like Baidu and Tencent, the Chinese web fiction industry boasts over 26 million stories, a good amount of which are still ongoing works written by contracted authors. These writers come from all corners of the globe to write, paid by the word, for an audience that has cultivated the habit of reading serialized web fiction for nearly 2 decades. Genres like wuxia, xianxia, and danmei novels, gay male romances that appeal mainly to straight women, have found booming fan bases in China and beyond. In fact, danmei novels like Heaven's Official Blessing have even landed on the New York Times bestseller list, hitting the mainstream an entire hemisphere away. But the growing commercialization of web fiction often spells disaster. Many Chinese web fiction authors are writing under a contract. Imagine this: you're an independent author, possibly a hobbyist. You have the skills and the passion, but you don't have a lawyer. Even if you do know that your contract will lock you into low pay with no voice for years, you may still sign it because you're afraid that, otherwise, you'll miss your chance at fame. You might simply have no other options and need to swim among sharks. This is one of the dark sides of web fiction, something Chinese companies are infamous for. While overwork, burnout, dismal reviews, and hostile readers are common problems among even the most successful online authors, blatant exploitation through predatory contracts is all too preventable. In some cases, authors can even be stripped of their copyright, with no way to regain it. Such exploitative contracts are generally used by smaller web fiction sites, but many have reported that larger sites like webnovel.com do the same thing. There's another company whose business decisions have effects on web fiction: Amazon. You see, Amazon is how many web serials take the world by storm. Series that started as hits on web fiction sites, such as He Who Fights with Monsters and Defiance of the Fall, now garner millions of dollars in revenue after transitioning to Amazon's ebook platform, Kindle. In fact, these books have even risen above works by mainstream authors such as Stephen King and Brandon Sanderson. Most of the time, the acclaim web fiction writers receive is solely from the cult following of a single story. Now, a large part of that revenue is coming from ebook sales. Kindle Direct Publishing promises authors who self-publish on their platform 70% of the profits. This is twice the cut that web novel contracts offer. So these conditions are more ethical and therefore the world is perfect, right? But Kindle also has a much more lucrative program where essentially Amazon members can read as many ebooks as they like for a subscription fee, and Amazon will pay the authors for every page these users read. This is where the real money for indie authors comes in. But there's a catch. Authors who opt into this program can't publish or host their fiction anywhere else. Clearly, Amazon Kindle wants to become an aggregate fiction site in its own right, one that taps into the commercial power that web fiction proves to possess. Since at least 1998, we've seen the growing aggregation of web fiction. Now, that aggregation is combining with commercialization, which means paywalls and growing corporate control. On the other hand, it also means ever-growing exposure and the ever-realer dream that any hobbyist writer who puts out a digital tip jar might be able to spend fewer hours on a grueling day job and instead put a little more time each day into writing the fantasies that they and their readers love. Web fiction is not what it was 10 or even 5 years ago. Fanfiction.net is not quite the giant it used to be, and LiveJournal has fallen hard. To say nothing of personal fiction blogs, which have nearly been wiped out. Considering the impact that the early internet had on budding authors, that's kind of a shame, but writing itself never died. Indeed, on today's aggregate websites, you tend to find fanfiction coexisting with original settings, and both of these together with translations of the most celebrated web sagas from around the world. There's something poetic about that. The truth is, web fiction was never just web fiction. Its influence was never locked to hobbyist niches on the internet. What's changed today is that it's so much more obvious. Web fiction is invading. It's streaming, it's adapted into movies, it's selling digital and hard copies on Amazon, and it's even circling back to traditional publishers. It's becoming mainstream, and in many ways, already is. It will only continue bringing new mixtures of genres to the fore. The world of web fiction is so endlessly diverse that we couldn't even scratch the surface in one brief video. We didn't get to tell you why so many dungeons in online fiction happen to be alive and shiny, or why cozy fantasies are more popular than ever. We didn't even get to tell you what an isekai is. It all just reached beyond the scope of this video. But not on our channel. Here at Moonquill, we're on a mission to make the best web fiction content on YouTube. If you like this video, or web fiction as much as we do, then we've got good news. This is part 1 of a multiple-part series. Like to show your support, subscribe to know when the next part is uploaded, and comment down below to chime in with your favorite unsung web fiction topics. We might just cover them. Thanks for watching.